My name is Angela Asanti-Poku, and I am 44 years old. I spent 15 years as a property manager, residential buildings, lease agreements, tenant disputes, eviction proceedings, and the specific paperwork that determines who has the legal right to remain in a home and who does not. I know what a lease is. I know what an authorized occupant is versus a leaseholder, and I know exactly what the difference produces when the leaseholder dies or leaves and the landlord decides to act on that distinction. I know what a constructive eviction is, what a notice to vacate requires, and what timeline a tenant has to respond before their options begin to close. I knew all of this. When my partner of 9 years, Kofi, died suddenly at 43, we were not married. We had talked about it, the way couples who have been together 9 years talk about the things they have not yet done, but we had not done it. The apartment we shared for 7 of those 9 years was leased in his name only. My name appeared on the emergency contact line, not on the lease. 12 days after Kofi's funeral, his landlord, a property management company, not an individual, sent a notice to the apartment addressed to the estate of Kofi Mensah and all occupants. The notice stated that the lease had terminated upon the leaseholder's death per the terms of the agreement, and that all occupants had 30 days to vacate. I had 7 years of belongings in that apartment. I had nowhere arranged to go. And I had 15 years of property management experience, sitting in my chest like a slow fire that I chose to use as light rather than heat. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories. My name is Angela, and this is the channel where what you built professionally becomes what protects you personally when everything else falls apart.
Subscribe.
Leave your city below. This story starts with a 30-day notice and ends with a negotiated extension and a settlement, and between those two things is 15 years of knowing exactly how landlords think, what they can do, and more importantly, what they cannot. Let me tell you about Kofi first. Kofi Mensah was a graphic designer. He was the kind of person who made spaces beautiful. Our apartment was full of his choices, his art, the particular arrangement of things that reflects how someone sees the world. He had signed the original lease 7 years before his death, 2 years into our relationship, when we decided to move in together. It was his name on the lease because he had found the apartment, because his credit was straightforward at that point, and because we had not thought very carefully about what it meant for my name not to be there.
We had meant to add me.
We had mentioned it once, maybe twice over the years, and then life moved forward in the way it does, and we never submitted the paperwork. When Kofi died, a brain aneurysm, no warning, I was 44 years old and living in an apartment where I had no legal standing as a tenant. I want to be honest about what I felt when the notice arrived. I felt the particular fury of someone who knows exactly what is happening, who understands the legal mechanism being used against her, and who is also in the middle of grief that sits on top of everything like weather. I let myself feel that for one evening. I made tea. I called my sister. I cried. The next morning I got up and I went to work on the problem. The first thing I did was read the lease. I know this sounds obvious. It is obvious. It is also the thing that most people in this situation do not do because they are grieving and frightened, and the document is 22 pages of legal language designed to be difficult to hold. I read it because 15 years of property management means I have read hundreds of leases, and I know that the language that sounds absolute sometimes isn't, and that the gap between what a landlord says and what the lease actually permits is a gap that occasionally works in a tenant's favor. The lease contained a standard clause. The tenancy shall terminate upon the death of the leaseholder. It also contained a clause I noted carefully. In the event of leaseholder death, the estate shall have 30 days to vacate the premises and return possession. The estate. Not the occupants. The estate. This was a distinction that mattered. I was not the estate. I was an occupant. The notice had been sent to the estate and all occupants, grouping us together, but the lease clause applied specifically to the estate. Whether the landlord had the right to require me, as an occupant who had continuously resided in the unit for 7 years, to vacate on the same timeline as the estate was a question the lease did not cleanly answer. I also looked at our state's tenant protection statutes, which I knew because 15 years of property management requires knowing the landlord side of those statutes very well. Our state had an implied tenancy provision. A person who has continuously occupied a dwelling with the knowledge and acceptance of the landlord, paid rent, and received receipts may establish tenancy rights even without formal lease documentation. I had not paid rent. Kofi had paid rent. But I had lived there for 7 years with the landlord's knowledge. They had my name as emergency contact. They had interacted with me. I had been present for every inspection. The implied tenancy argument was not airtight, but it was an argument. And in property management, an argument is sometimes all you need to change the shape of a conversation. I called my former colleague Marcus, who had left property management to work as a tenant rights attorney. I described the situation. He listened. He said, "What does the lease say about subletting and authorized occupants?" I checked. The lease prohibited subletting without written consent, but did not define or restrict authorized occupants in any specific way. Kofi had never formally notified the landlord that I was an occupant, but they knew. 7 years of inspections. 7 years of me being present. My name on the emergency contact. Marcus said, "The landlord is probably right that the lease terminated. The question is whether you have independent tenancy rights that survive the lease's termination." That's the argument I'd make. He also said something I had said to tenants myself over the years. The landlord wants possession of the apartment. They do not necessarily want a prolonged legal dispute that delays that possession by months and costs them legal fees. If you give them a reason to negotiate rather than litigate, most property management companies will negotiate. I said, "What's my leverage?" He said, "Filing a claim that you have independent tenancy rights creates a dispute that has to be resolved before they can legally re-let the unit. They can't rent it to someone else with an active tenancy claim pending. Every month that unit sits empty costs them money. That is your leverage." I said, "Walk me through the filing." Marcus filed a notice of tenancy claim on my behalf within a week. It asserted that I had established implied tenancy through continuous occupancy with the landlord's knowledge, that the 30-day notice applied to the estate and not to independent occupants, and that I was entitled to a reasonable notice period consistent with state tenant protection law, which, for a long-term tenancy of more than 5 years, was 90 days at minimum. The property management company's response came through their legal department. It was firm, but it was a response, which meant they were engaging rather than filing for immediate eviction. That was, as Marcus said, the first signal that they were calculating costs. Their position: I had no formal lease. The implied tenancy doctrine did not apply because Kofi had been the sole leaseholder and there was no evidence I had paid rent independently. The 30-day notice was valid. Marcus's reply walked through the landlord's own conduct: 7 years of inspections at which I was present and never challenged as an unauthorized occupant, the emergency contact designation, a maintenance request I had submitted in my own name 3 years prior that the company had fulfilled without objection. Their own actions, he argued, constituted acceptance of my occupancy. He also raised a point I had given him. In our state, attempting to remove a long-term occupant without due process, regardless of the formal lease structure, constituted a potential violation of the state tenant protection statute, which carried penalties that the property management company would prefer not to litigate. The response from their legal team came 2 weeks later. It was shorter. It offered a negotiated exit agreement. The negotiated agreement gave me 90 days, not 30, to vacate the apartment, with no rent required for the final month and a relocation payment of $4,500 drawn from the security deposit Kofi had paid 7 years ago, which under the circumstances could not be returned to his estate in the normal way. It was not permanent occupancy. I had not expected permanent occupancy. What I needed was time to find a place, to manage the grief and the logistics simultaneously, to do in 90 days what I had been told I needed to do in 30. I signed the agreement. I found an apartment. I moved on my own timeline with money in my pocket rather than nothing. What I want you to know, if you are living with a partner in an apartment that is leased in their name only, is this: add your name to the lease.
Today.
Not this month. Today. Contact the landlord or property management company and ask to be added as a co-leaseholder. Most landlords will require a credit check. Most will say yes if you have been a reliable long-term occupant. The conversation takes 15 minutes. The paperwork takes a week. What it gives you is legal standing that protects you if something happens to your partner. If your landlord will not add you, ask to be formally designated as an authorized occupant in writing. It is not as strong as being a leaseholder, but it is documentation. If you are in a common law marriage state, understand your rights. If you are not, understand what that means for your housing if your partner dies. One action. Today, look at your lease and find the leaseholder line. If your name is not there, start the conversation. Kofi and I meant to fix this. We meant to do it for years. Meaning to do something and doing it are separated by a form and a phone call, and that distance is not very large until the moment it becomes the only distance that matters. I live now in an apartment that is leased in my name. My name only, which is an odd thing to feel proud of, but I do feel it. The specific security of a document that says I belong here, that cannot be dissolved by someone else's death or departure. I think about Kofi when I unlock the door of the new place. Not with the sharp, specific grief of the first year, with something that has changed shape, the way grief does when you give it enough time and enough forward motion. He was a man who made spaces beautiful. I am a woman who makes sure the paperwork reflects who lives in them. Both of those things mattered in the end. I made 7 years of our life in that apartment worth having. My knowledge made it possible to leave it on my own terms. Know who is on the lease. That is the whole of it.